Welcome to another episode of the Coffee and Podcast. We are all about coffee education and cultivating freedom. I'm your host, Philip Clayman. I'm also one of the co-founders of Three Tree Coffee in Statesboro, Georgia. I'm very excited to have Bryn Frere-Smith on the show today, who's the founder of Blue Bear Coffee in Norwich, England, which is committed to eradicating slavery using coffee. Sound familiar? I think it does too, and I'm super excited to hear how their journey has taken them to using coffee to end human trafficking. Super excited to jump into today's episode. Before we do that, I do want to give a quick warning that we do talk about more sensitive subjects with these type of episodes when it comes to ending human trafficking. And so we just encourage viewer and listener discretion before diving into these types of episodes. All right, so Bryn, super pumped to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining. Why don't you first just tell us a little bit about your life before Blue Bear?
Absolutely. Thanks, Philip, for having me on. And may I start by congratulating you on the perfect pronouncement of my name, which is not always easily achieved. So thank you for that. Life before Blue Bear. Well, I suppose I'll try and keep it to what's pertinent. But I would say I'm a blessed guy. I was brought up by two parents that loved me. I felt safe at home. I went to a school that was provided for me by the country, by the UK, the country where I live. We get free education. We get free healthcare. There are lots of advantages that I try not to take for granted that I was fortunate and privileged enough to have as a normal and have as a default. So I grew up in a safe part of the world in southeast England, in a little town, little village, had a big castle in it, which I thought was perfectly normal growing up there. It wasn't until I aged that I realized that was quite unusual to have a castle in your hometown that went back 1,000 years to the 1066 Norman invasion of UK. I used to walk past that on the way to my primary school. And all things pertaining to anti-human trafficking probably started after I joined the force, the police, what we refer to in England as the job. I have a coffee shop now, and very often we have police officers, ex and serving, come in, and we refer to it as the job. And I joined the job out of uni. So I was a police officer in Norfolk, the city where I'm talking to you from today, in Norwich, for 4 years. And then I transferred to the London Metropolitan Police Service to work in what's deemed covert policing operations. So that's where you strip off the uniform, you go in with your Converse and your jeans, and you try and catch people committing crime in the act. The idea is you conduct surveillance operations in order to proactively target criminals rather than just to do it historically, to investigate crimes that have taken place. So I worked in surveillance. I left the police in 2014, not for any particularly scandalous reasons, Philip, I must say. Feel free to Google me. You won't find anything too incriminating, hopefully. So I came out just frustrated, actually, in my little way. I didn't feel like I was really moving the needle when it came to seeing justice done. And if you're somebody that feels like the issue of justice is something that's been on your heart from a young age, you would think being a police officer is a great way to influence that subject in some way. And it is. It absolutely is. But also, when you're working in an enormous organization like the Metropolitan Police, it's easy to feel quite disconnected from seeing real sustainable change take place because of your actions. And I was a millennial. I am a millennial. I grew up with this terribly overinflated idea of myself and wanted to experience something in my life where I felt like I was leaving a positive impact, seeing positive change. And I thought that actually I might have more impact leaving an organization like the police rather than existing within it. So I came out of the police in 2014 and quite unimaginably started a security company with a former police officer that I joined with. And for the last 10 years, we've been managing all manners of different threats and risks in that role. And we still have the company. I'm not as involved now. I'm more full-time with Blue Bear, but it's giving me some amazing opportunities. A lot of the work I personally did, my part of the company was working in close protection. So I've worked with some incredible clients. I've traveled all over the world and had a very privileged seat in many places in the world because of that particular role. And then I spent a good chapter of the last 10 years working specifically in anti-human trafficking operations. So that's been through a number of NGOs that I've had the opportunity to work for. And all of that leads into working in coffee somehow.
Yeah. Well, so let's hang on the policing for a second, because you clearly have a passion for justice. I've watched some of your videos through Blue Bear. Even just hearing you talk about it now, you're clearly very passionate about the subject of justice. And I'm kind of curious, was that something that you brought into the police force, or is that something that was maybe even cultivated during the police force? Was there something you saw or some experience you had that kind of cultivated that? Where did it come from?
Oh, it's a great question. I think so often is the case. What's the quote? Show me a boy at 7 and I'll show you a man. And I think there is an innate tendency to have a certain hue. I think there are characteristics that we all have in us, which makes for an amazing, diverse world that in its perfect form, we would all contribute in some way to society, to making the wheels turn smoothly. And I think I had that in my core from birth. I remember even in this very quaint, safe town, village where I grew up, I was about 10 years old, and I'd been up the park playing football with my buddies, and we were walking home one summer evening, and very, very unusually, I witnessed a violent assault. A man came out of a restaurant with his girlfriend or partner, and he grabbed her by the throat, he pushed her against the wall, and he headbutted her in the face. And her face began bleeding, and she looked petrified. And even as a 10-year-old, I thought, well, absolutely no, absolutely no way is that happening. And me and my two little prepubescent buddies ran over the road, and we didn't want to fight this guy. We didn't know what we were doing. We were scrawny little boys, but we at least interrupted what was taking place, and the police was called. It gave this lady an opportunity to escape. So that was my first, obvious experience of injustice, but also the importance of responding to injustice, of intervening, not just crossing the road, looking the other way. And I've seen that time and time again at different parts of my life. Now, I have to add that there are many times where I have not acted bravely, and there are many times where there have been opportunities to intervene, and I've chosen to look after myself rather than put myself in harm's way. So I don't want to give myself an unnecessarily or inaccurately a positive review, but I do feel like it's something that's a major part of my personality. And actually, there's a contribution from you fine people in America. I got the opportunity to study abroad when I was at university, and I ended up at it must be one of the top universities in the States. It's called Wichita State University. It must be up there with Brown and MIU and MIT and all of those fantastic institutions. But I was there because I didn't know where else to go. I actually saw that it had a great sports stadium on the internet, early days of the internet. And I thought, great, I was a rugby player in the UK. I'll go and play American football. I'm sure I could walk straight onto a team and that'll be what I'll do. Complete lack of due diligence. And I turned up, and this guy picked me up from the airport and said, hey, I got to ask you, buddy, why did you pick Wichita? And I said, well, I'm going to play for your team. You've obviously got a big sports stadium. I take it it's for American football. I'd love to come and try out. Not only had I completely missed your season, it was like January 1st when I arrived, and the season was halfway through. But also, they didn't have a football team. Sadly, it died in a plane crash many years before, and they'd written it off. So that was the start of my American adventure. But what I did do is I took a class whilst I was at Wichita State, taken by a serving detective. And this detective had managed to catch the local serial killer. Of course, in America, you have local serial killers. We don't struggle in the same way here in England. But it was the most fascinating 6-week course that I've ever been on. And it transformed my idea of education. And I think that, of many other contributing factors, might have led me into a career in law enforcement.
Wow. And so, clearly it was something that was a passion of yours, kind of innately from a young age. You even saw it in some of the things you witnessed in yourself. And then, in terms of some of the education you had as well, it was becoming evident that this is something you're passionate about. And then you left the job And may I just add, it would be amazing if there was a castle where I had grown up. That sounds epic. I don't know if that's just me. I'm sure some of our listeners who are not from England will find that pretty awesome. But you left the job and you started a securities company. And so now, where are you at now? Because as I've done some research, it seems like securities and risk management is kind of your main gig, with coffee as the side hustle. But maybe you don't view it that way. Tell us where you're at now with those things.
Good. Yeah. Well, actually, now I feel like 99% of my time is working in the business, and we have a charity too. Those two things are combined. My involvement in security has taken a back seat, but you're absolutely right in identifying that. That's a fairly recent development. We opened the site that I'm sitting in now, our first takeaway coffee shop, our espresso bar here in Norwich, in August last year. And since then, I've been very much full time with Blue Bear. We still have the company, we still have a few projects, the security world, but I'm not as involved as I once was. So hopefully both of my feet now are firmly planted in the Blue Bear camp. But actually, certainly since starting Blue Bear, I went back to the world of security, having worked in anti-trafficking, having had some moving experiences that led me to create Blue Bear, or inspired me to create Blue Bear. I had to earn money. I would love to have taken a salary from Blue Bear, but they didn't feel right. I wanted to make sure that every penny that we made was going back into the business, was reinvested in what we were doing. So I had to go back to what I knew in order to grow Blue Bear and make that sustainable and give it a chance of life rather than be quick to take out of it. So it's been 5 years. It was 5 years almost exactly before I took any money out of Blue Bear and take a very modest salary, a very reasonable salary. And we're really committed to transparency. So all of that's online. So there's no big director dividends. No one's getting rich here, because we have a very specific aim at fighting this issue, this humanitarian issue, with every ounce of profit we can squeeze from this brand.
Yeah. And so now let's dive right into the story behind starting it. I've read it online, but you share it with our viewers. Why did you start Blue Bear, and why is it named Blue Bear?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I was working for, once again, an American organization and a US NGO called International Justice Mission. I had been a security advisor at a venture capital investment firm in central London, and felt like this was such a long way away from pursuing justice. It was time for a plenary in my career. So I took a sabbatical and I went to work for IJM for free as a volunteer. And I was one of two former police officers hired that year to support existing investigation teams. I got deployed to the DR, and prior to arriving, well, fortunately a few weeks prior to arriving, but I thought I was off to Africa. I thought, right, I'm off to the Democratic Republic of Congo. I need to go and get my jabs. It turned out I was off to the Caribbean and the Dominican Republic, which I thought was a bit of a win, really. And it was. I mean, maybe you've been, maybe some of your listeners have been. It's the most stunningly beautiful country, but it's a complex country. It's a country of the haves and the have-nots. There's a great chasm that lies between them, and the majority of the population would live in that latter category. But there's great wealth there too, and an enormously great beauty. And I went to work on an existing project IJM had set up in response to the prevalence of children being sexually abused, or actually sold, the commercial sexual exploitation of children. That was the brand of injustice that was attached to this project, what was referred to as CSEC. And I went there to support the investigation team, and we worked in partnership with the police and the federal officers there that had a responsibility for investigating this crime type. Being, as you can see, Philip, a white man with red hair and tattoos, it was quite helpful for the Dominican police force to have someone they could deploy in certainly tourist-rich areas that they might not have the same opportunity to get access. So that was my role, was to work in an undercover capacity, not dissimilar to some of the jobs I had in the police, or I was associated with in the police, and to get footage and evidence that we could then use to go back with the police to build a case, to respond to these cases of children being sexually exploited for commercial gain, and close the net. And the start of Blue Bear, well, as you can imagine, just dealing in this world is extremely taxing. No amount of time that's passed since that time, that year in the DR, has in any way dulled my memory of the complexity and the emotional damage that did, just being around heartbreak as a job. And the organization, I really do speak very highly of IJM. They do a great deal to support one another. We had an amazing team around us. But that doesn't get away from the fact that I was actively looking for children being sold for sex, which has got to be, by anybody's standard, one of the worst injustices imaginable. And it came at a price. And I found it very, very hard on a personal level. And about 6 months in, we were approaching Christmas time, and I had booked a flight home for Christmas for a 2-week Christmas break. And that was, in all honesty, all I was thinking about at the time. And we went in response to an allegation that had been made by a 14-year-old girl to her school teacher that her mother had started taking money from local men so they could sleep with her, so they could have sex with her. And she didn't want that to take place, but she felt she couldn't stop it from taking place, and there were grave consequences should she resist. And she was actually really worried about her younger brother and sister. If that sort of activity was taking place in their home, how long would it be until these children became victims of it too? So she spoke up at school. The school contacted the police. The police officer in that area was an enthusiast on this type of crime. They were really building a profile for responding to cases of child exploitation in their community. They were so positive about it, about having a positive response, an immediate response, rather than, oh, silly girl, maybe she's made this all up. She's had a fight with her mum and she's trying to cause trouble. No, this was a great set of receiving ears for this allegation to land in. And she contacted us, and we supported her in investigating that case. And I say investigating it, obviously there's a way of capturing evidence that doesn't require us to put in mini cameras and watch this sort of abuse. We actually removed the children out of the situation straight away. And there were examinations that took place post-incident that gave us evidence that what she was claiming to be taking place was legitimate, was valid. And I was so inspired by this young woman. And when we gave her the opportunity to collect some items from home, is there anything we can collect for you from home? Because it's a good chance that you're not going to be seeing your mum anytime soon. She's probably going with the police and could end up in prison. That's a difficult thing for any young person to conceive. But she asked for her blue teddy bear. That was it. It wasn't one item amongst the list of items. It was the only thing she asked for. And I had this photograph of her sat in the back of our support vehicle with her young brother, with her young sister. She was already the hero of the day. Like, she'd got her brother and sister out of that situation. She had no idea what was in front of her. She'd left behind whatever home life she had. And she had this blue teddy bear sat on her lap. And rather than it being squeezed tight to her chest, head over the shoulder, it was sat facing forward like any other passenger in the vehicle. And as I studied it, it appeared to me that actually she was also rescuing her teddy. It was like, I got my brother out, I got my sister out, I got my teddy out, let's go. There was no concern for her items, her clothing, her school materials. No, I've just got to get all of my family out. And it just broke my heart, and it still does now. 6 years later, when I tell the story, it still breaks my heart that was the life that this child was experiencing. And it's not necessarily a happy ending, Philip. Like, it inspired me to create something. We started a fund. It started as a teddy bear fund, and it's grown into a business. And we found that business is the best vehicle to build sustainable change, to raise money without robbing Peter to pay Paul, without taking out of other people's pots, without approaching other donors. And it's working, but I still feel that there's a lot of work to be done. And in this child's case, she went into state support, and that's not great in the Dominican Republic. I'd like to hope it's improved since then. And the last I heard was that she still had a desire to go back to mum when mum was released from prison. And there's a lot of damage that needs to be undone there. And that's what we're focusing on with the charity that we've set up, is actually undoing some of that damage. So we work with some amazing partners that take time with children, not just to give them somewhere safe to live, but to give them the space to understand what's happened to them, understand that was not right, and they're worth so much more than that, and rebuild a life of ambition, a life of hope. And so that's where the majority of the money we raise goes, is actually rebuilding the lives of children and young people affected by human trafficking.
An incredible story and an incredible mission. And so then how does this all get connected to coffee? I mean, you even mentioned there's a Blue Bear Fund. Where did coffee come into play? Because there's lots of different industries that could be used in human trafficking. And I would love to know what took you to the coffee industry.
Yeah, it's a great question, perhaps similar to your story, but I felt that coffee was a great vehicle for us. And I love coffee. I've loved coffee for several years. I love the nuance of it. I love the diversity of it. I love the fact that as an anti-slavery organization, we get to engage in exemplifying best practice models of sourcing coffee from global south countries, often from developing countries, and doing it in a way that promotes business in those communities. It's actually preventing exploitation by ensuring that the farmers who we buy coffee beans from are being paid regularly and fairly for their crop. So that gives us an opportunity to engage as a business. Well, this is the best possible way we think we can trade with the developing world. But also, it reaches so many people. So many people drink coffee. And of course, there are the odd freak that don't like coffee, but most people do. And so it's a great way of reaching as many people as possible. We could have chosen a more esoteric product, a more niche product. And people do. And that's awesome, But we thought, let's pick something broad. Let's pick something that can influence as many people as possible. But also it has such a positive connotation. Coffee, my early morning coffee. I can't do anything before my early morning coffee, or I can't wait to meet my friend for coffee. Oh, it's got to that time in the day. I need to just take a break and enjoy a coffee. It's very unusual that people speak negatively about coffee. And for all of those reasons and more, we went with coffee. And I think although the profit could have been more in other commodities or in other products, coffee has worked really well for what we're trying to achieve.
Hmm. Absolutely. And we've seen that as well, the power that it has to mobilize communities, build communities and mobilize communities, and just to get people's attention. It's been fascinating. And I completely agree about there's maybe more lucrative ways to raise funds or to run a business. And yet it's amazing that this seemingly unimportant commodity, forgive me, I love coffee, but at the same time, it's not a necessity to life. It's a luxury and it's nice.
Mm.
And yet it can be used to really get people's attention and to mobilize them. And then love y'all's passion for sourcing ethically. I one time was talking with someone who they met a farmer in Honduras that was an agrarian farmer, grew corn, right? And because they were not able to make enough money off their corn, they ended up getting involved in various activities, not good activities, right? Human trafficking, some drug activities. And a lot of it started with, I'm just not making enough money with how I farm. I mean, a lot of this comes down to supply chains. And are we willing to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to, we want to support and buy ethically? And I think that's an incredible initiative that you have. And so then you raise money for other organizations, you buy ethically. Help unpack some of these things. What are some of the organizations you partner with to end human trafficking through Blue Bear?
Yeah, so we supported three charities. We supported IJM, who I had volunteered for, and where this journey started for us. And then we also supported an organization called Justice and Care in the UK that works in India, Bangladesh, Thailand, Romania, and the UK. I later went to work for them. And then the UK Modern Slavery Helpline, which is run by a charity called Unseen. So these were three partners that I identified as fantastic models that we could get behind and try and support. But actually, 3 years into Blue Bear, I flew out back to the Dominican to reunite with friends and looked to potentially open a coffee shop in the Dominican Republic that would give safe employment to some of our survivors. And then realized on that trip, actually, they didn't want to work in a coffee shop. There are other things that they wanted to do with their lives, and they were disparately located across the country. They didn't want to be centralized and aggregated in order to work in my coffee shop. That was my dream. It wasn't theirs. So what we came away with was the idea of, well, what can we do for you? If you've got your own aspirations, how can we support that and those? And we started an organization called Blue Bear Freedom. That's a registered charity in the Dominican Republic and the UK. And we've got two models. One is a preventative project. So we have a children's storybook called Brave. It's been translated into multiple languages, including Spanish. It's called Valiente. And it's aimed at a primary school age child. It tells the story of a child and a coffee roaster and a bear. But it's got this narrative of identifying modern slavery and responding to that. So that's become a resource that we're giving away to churches, to NGOs, to schools, to anyone that will take it and deploy it and use it in at-risk communities. So that's our preventative side. And then we have a restorative side. So we work with an amazing shelter home in the Dominican Republic called Lily House that do the long, hard miles when a young person arrives at their door with this sort of lived experience. And we love Lily House. I've been witnessing the great work of Lily House since I was working in the Dominican Republic in 2017. So that's where the money goes at the moment. We've sort of shrunk down from distributing to multiple organizations. So let's just have 2 projects and let's do them really well and comprehensively. And we'll see where we go from there. But I'm not rushing beyond that at this moment.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that Blue Bear started as an online company, but now you're kind of, I think you're even sitting in a more retail-oriented space, and that's a direction that you're taking it. So where do you hope this to go, or where is it at now in terms of what you want Blue Bear to become?
Yes. Well, I've never been much of a 5-year plan sort of guy, Philip. I don't know if that's a weakness. It probably is. I think most entrepreneurs like to have a plan and a vision and a purpose and a mission and all of those buzzwords. I tend to stumble from one day to the next. And of course, we have an idea where we're going, but I like to try and avoid it being too predefined because things change. Who could have predicted a pandemic? It just so happened that we did really well out of the pandemic. We were an online company that grew significantly over the pandemic. But we now have an amazing coffee shop. It wasn't an obvious place to go. Although you run a coffee company, you'd think that's an obvious thing to do. It wasn't for me. I realized, having supplied coffee shops up and down the country, how close the margins were. And so many coffee shops fail because someone sent me an Instagram post the other day and said, how to make £1 million from a coffee shop, start with £2 million. that's the truth. It's just so much cost to get out of that latte or flat white, But you used that word community earlier. And not only is this profit positive at the moment, praise God, it's also been so brilliant at building a community. And it's the most strange, beautiful, diverse salad bowl community of misfits and corporates and all sorts. And I'm loving that. And it's enabled us to grow our brand and meet new partners in the form of not just regular coffee consumers, but businesses and local charities that we can work together with. We're very well connected with the police here and other NGOs that touch on this particular subject, and local businesses that come by and go, well, that's great. Listen, we normally do a Christmas time fundraiser. Let's do it for you guys this year. And so that's been incredible. I spoke recently for a financial services company because the boss comes here. He loves his flat whites. And those opportunities wouldn't have been necessarily afforded to us if we remained in the virtual, if we were just online. So having an in-person space has brought so much more value than just trying to make sure your end of day, your numbers are in the black and not the red. So there is a possibility that we'll look to do this in other parts of the country. I'm not 100% confident of that yet. I want to let a year or two go by with this place, but it is looking good. And like I said, those other added benefits of having a place, building a community and spreading the word of why we exist and what this problem is, there's a lot of value in that. So there's a possibility we'll scale the coffee shop model. But every year is different, and we just put one foot in front of the other. We've been so blessed that we've now gone 10x in 6 years. So what we turned over in year one is now we're turning over 10 times that, and we're still in profit. So on paper, it's been very successful, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself on that. And I think that some of that is because we are quite a slow grower. Even though I'm saying 10x, this is not a £1 million turnover company right now. So let's just do the next good thing.
Yeah, that's incredible. And love hearing about the growth. That's incredible. And so then, I imagine it's difficult. In fact, I would even say I know it's difficult balancing the responsibilities of you got to run a business. It's got to be sustainable. It's got to make a profit. I mean, it's got to work. it's got to pay the bills. And yet we also are really doing it for a much bigger purpose that we want to fuel with money, with time, with mobilization. Have you found that balance difficult to achieve? Or have you really found a rhythm there that you think works well?
Oh, it's very difficult to achieve. It's very difficult to. Every day there's an opportunity for you to take a shortcut. Every time you buy, where you buy your coffee cups from, where you buy your coffee from, where you buy your merchandise from, where you buy your clothing from, every one of those we're trying to hold ourselves to account. And of course, when you do buy something that's using organic cotton and harm-free dyes, etc., it's going to cost 2, 3, 4, 10 times what it would cost for you to look the other way on that subject. And it's the same with every product that we retail. But we have to be consistent. It is imperative that we are consistent with every facet of the business. And it does result in thinner margins. But what I didn't want to do is give anybody the opportunity to take a sledgehammer to what we're trying to build here and say, yeah, that's great what you're doing with your profits, but you're actually incubating situations of injustice in the way you're buying or the way you're operating or the way you underpay your staff or exploit volunteers or whatever it might be. And no business is perfect, but there's absolutely every reason we should aim for that. And what tends to go in exchange is profitability. But that's okay with me. That's okay with me. I think it will come good if we are consistent and if we hold ourselves to account and we hold ourselves to a very high ideal. I think that does cascade into the brand and what we represent. It's much more coherent and consistent. So, is it easy? Absolutely not. Absolutely. We have a teddy bear. I was determined with all that started this business with a teddy bear that one day we'd get a chance to retail a teddy bear. And gosh, I looked everywhere to find a partner that would produce us a teddy bear. And I could have bought some fantastically accurate teddy bears from what sort of the vision we had from China for a couple of pounds a piece or wherever. But I wasn't going to be completely confident of the situation in which that was produced. But I didn't. We bought one from an amazing partner in Europe that is a fair trade plus organization. It's a B Corp certified organization. And those teddy bears cost me a fortune. But we had to do what was right. And we have to exemplify that at every stage. And that's a challenge. That's not always easy, but I think it's one we have to be consistent with.
Yeah. So there's a lot that we've already shared about. I mean, there's NGOs that are being worked with. There's NGOs that have been started. There's a book that's been written. There's online coffee. There's a retail store. Bryn, how are you everywhere at once? Who are the other people behind the scenes? And what kind of role do you find yourself playing with the team? Do you focus on one more than the other? Are you just literally Energizer Bunny running around doing all these things? What is it like day to day for you?
Well, I've been using the royal we from day one. It was far easier to say we than I, because no one likes someone, certainly in the UK, we tend to be fairly self-deprecating. And whenever someone talks about themselves a lot, it's quite unpleasant, isn't it? So I used we from day one, but actually initially it was a solo project. I say solo. I've been very well supported by friends and family from the get-go. And very early on, we built a community of people largely leveraged on volunteers. Today, we do have paid staff. It's amazing, and they are amazing. And they've contributed so much to Blue Bear beyond their role within the company. But still, up to recently, when we first opened the shop, I didn't know how much money we were going to have at the end of the week. I didn't know if we could afford to pay other baristas. So I worked the machine myself. And that was a joy. But it got to a point that one day I sort of swaggered around. I couldn't find a balance point. I felt like I was on a ship in a storm. It was awful. And I had to close the shop early and just lie on the floor because the sky for me was spinning round and round. I just reached exhaustion. And the very next day, the 6'2" Australian lady called Lucy walked in and say, "Hi, I'm at university. I'm looking for some part-time work. I'm a barista from Australia," and with a far more convincing accent than that, and made me this incredible flat white, and I, got the job on the spot. And then a few months later, Yev, a friend of ours who'd been coming as a customer, never mentioned that she could make coffee, and she was from the Ukraine. She was over here as a refugee and had an amazing story. She was an amazing young woman. And she just challenged me once, why don't you pour a bear on the top of your latte? So latte art, you can do a bear design fairly simply. Oh, can you now? Well, why don't you show me, Yev? So she got behind the machine and poured this incredible bear. And I was like, when can you start? And so the team has grown, but there are still, we're still highly leveraged on people coming and saying, listen, I want to get involved. I want to get some skin in the game. I want to make a contribution. How can I help? And it might be web designers or graphic designers. It could be people that do podcasts like yourself that are kind enough to invite us on to share our stories. So it is a community. It's that word again that has enabled us to achieve what we have. And it's a joy. It's a real joy to be a part of.
Mm. You have seen some intense situations. You're on maybe a more enjoyable side of the work at this point, but I mean, you talked about your time in the DR, your time on the police force, and anyone that works in these industries know it's a pretty overwhelming problem. And you've seen it pretty directly. How do you stay hopeful in the midst of such overwhelming concern and depravity and injustice? How do you stay hopeful knowing that something's going to change?
That is a brilliant question, Philip, and it's not an easy question to respond to. I don't have any pre-packaged answer for you, unfortunately, because it is a challenge. I find it amazing that so much of what we read and listen to in the news is negative. And for fair reason, I'm not diminishing that. But the narrative so often is things are worse today than they ever were. And that's not always true. I think sometimes we look at things we're myopic in our sights. We're looking at things in a short period of time. But if you take a longer look, if you look back over a longer arc of history, you can see we've made remarkable progress. 200 years is the time frame I like to look. And 200 years ago, on almost all counts, we're in a worse position. So infant mortality, almost 1 in 2 children 200 years ago didn't see their 5th birthday. 46% infant mortality worldwide average 200 years ago. Now it's 4.6% worldwide average. Still too many, but that's a remarkable change. It's the same on most metrics. It's illiteracy, 10% of the world, only 10% of the world 200 years ago could read and write. 90% of the world couldn't read and write. Now it's flipped. We have 90% literacy around the world now. It's the same 90%, 10% with poverty. Only 10% of the world lived above the poverty line. Middle class is a modern phenomenon. We like to think this has always been the case, but actually 90% of the world 200 years ago lived in poverty. So we've made huge strides forward. But with this situation, with this particular issue of modern slavery, there has so much to be done. 200 years ago, certainly from the UK's perspective, we felt like we outlawed modern slavery. The transatlantic slave trade was a huge part of our economy, but this man, William Wilberforce, and his crew felt it was a wrong thing and went to great lengths to see it outlawed. And yet 200 years on, there are 50 million people at latest estimate still living in a defining situation of modern slavery. So I feel like it's a very hard subject to remain hopeful with. And there are other humanitarian issues where you can see daily progress. But this one is a challenge. Now, there are things to take hope from. 2015 in the UK, we had the Modern Slavery Act, and that's brought a lot of good with it. It's brought, of the many things that it's brought is a requirement for businesses of a certain turnover, a certain size, to have a modern slavery statement on their website that says what they're doing to eradicate modern slavery from their supply chains. So that didn't exist, 6-7 years ago, whatever it was, 8 years ago. So there are improvements. It is becoming, certainly in recent years, in recent decades, modern slavery has reappeared as a subject that we're becoming more and more aware of. And there's this quote I talked about William Wilberforce in this answer, but he is a bit of a hero of mine. And he had this quote: "You can choose to look the other way, but you can never say that you didn't know." And this is how he challenged people. And I feel that is more relevant today than at any time in history. With all of the information we have available to us now, through our phones, through our computers, through citizen journalism, through journalism worldwide, 24/7 media and news, we can't say that we're unaware of this anymore. We can't bury our head in the sand. And the more you and I and other people raise our voices and remind people of this injustice, less and less people can say they didn't know. But it's down to us to respond. It's down to us. Well, with that knowledge, what are you going to do about it? What is your contribution? What is your response? And for us, it's Blue Bear, and it's what we're trying to do through Blue Bear. And hopefully we give people a pretty low barrier to engagement. It can start by just coming here for coffee. It can just start by changing up your coffee supply, getting your business, your church, your restaurant, your pub, whatever, to buy your coffee from Blue Bear. It can start there, but hopefully it might then lead them into not just educating themselves about this injustice, but getting more involved in some way.
Absolutely. And I want to even extend that to our listeners. What a great challenge of, once you know, what are you going to do about it, right? What are you going to do about it? Once we have this knowledge, we have a responsibility to do something with it. And I'm insanely inspired by what you're doing, your story, just your knowledge on the subject. And I want to just end with kind of a goofy question, because you do this thing called Freeze for Freedom. And a polar plunge situation. So tell us a little bit more about that before we wrap up today's episode.
Polar plunge is a brilliant phrase. I'll have to steal that for next year's event. But yeah, so we still try. I mean, the majority of money raised is through the business, but we'll still do a couple of activities a year as fundraisers. And we felt that the UK is not the warmest of countries. In the summer, we do okay, but the rest of the year, it can be pretty chilly. Certainly at the start of the year. So the sea temperature when we did our Freeze for Freedom the other day was 3 degrees, I think, between 2 and 3 degrees, which is pretty cold by anyone's measure. So we all flung ourselves in the ocean as a start to the year, and a little bit of fun, really, and another way of building community and a way of raising a bit of money and a bit of awareness, doing something a bit crazy. And that was great. We have other groups around the country that buy our coffee, and youth groups that have gone out and done similar things, gone into a local lake, obviously safely and supervised and all that stuff, but done it in the middle of winter, in the midst of winter, as a way of raising some money and getting some support for Blue Bear Freedom. So that was fun. The challenge now is to think, what can we do in the summer? Because throwing ourselves in a lukewarm sea isn't going to raise any support. So we'll have to think of something this summer we can do as a fundraiser. But yeah, it was good. It was very refreshing. And I think we'll do it again next year.
That's great. Well, I love the creativity, love the adventure, and love the story. Bryn, how can people support Blue Bear and order some coffee?
Oh, fantastic. Difficult, because I can only imagine most of your listeners are US based. I don't know if that's true or not. And we don't ship to the US.
We have a couple in the
mainly,
UK.
Mainly
it's not very many listeners in the UK, but...
Well, if you're listening from the UK, then it's imperative that you go to bluebearcoffee.com and buy some coffee, and put a message on there that you came across us as a consequence of listening to this podcast. But please follow us. You don't have to live in the UK to follow along on social media. Instagram's probably the platform we use most. You can listen to our podcast. I haven't recorded an episode for a few years, so forgive me for that. But there's some great interviews on there. So have a look at that. It's called the Justice and Coffee Podcast. And you can, check that out too. But Blue Bear Coffee, at Blue Bear Coffee, and the coffee shop I'm in has got a separate account called at Blue Bear Tombland. Come follow us, be part of our journey. That would be great. We'd love to hear from you.
Awesome.
That would be amazing. Thank you, Philip, for giving me the opportunity.
Absolutely. We all definitely go check them out. Bryn, thank you so much for being on the show today. Incredibly inspired by your story, and love hearing from a fellow coffee activist who wants to see the world change, to see slavery eradicated, to see exploitation stop using coffee. So just thank you for all that you're doing, the inspiration.
Oh, thanks, mate. It's been a real pleasure.
Awesome. Well, to all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm your host, Philip Klayman, and thank you for helping us cultivate freedom.